Hello, everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is a free online community for everyone who's interested in depth and Jungian psychology. And you can find that at depthpsychologyalliance.com. And I'm here today with my guest, Robert Bosnak. Hi, Robert. Thanks for joining me.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so happy to be here with you today. Of course, we've done this a few times before, and I'm always really excited to talk about the particular topic that we are looking into, and that is alchemy. It's a topic that can be seen as so esoteric, and yet so many of us in the Jungian and depth psychological fields have often expressed a really profound interest for it. And so I'm really excited to be able to dig in a little bit. First of all, let me just share a little bit more about Robbie so that everybody can understand who he is and where he's coming from if you don't know him. Or even if you do know him, you might actually find something new that you didn't know before. Robert Bosnak is a Jungian psychoanalyst who graduated from the Jung Institute in Zurich in 1977. Since then, he has been in private practice in the United States and Australia. He founded the Santa Barbara Healing Sanctuary, developed a method of working with dreams called embodied imagination, and he's also written several books, among which are the worldwide bestseller, Little Course in Dreams, which I think a lot of people that are listening to this will know about. Robbie's also penned a series of novels, and the first one was released just last year. It's called Red Sulphur, The Greatest Mystery in Alchemy. And I know, Robbie, you had mentioned to me that you're working on the fourth one in that series right now. Some of the others yet.
Yes, I am. Yes, deeply into the fourth one. It's getting increasingly strange.
Yeah, well, these are very exciting, and we actually did an interview last year about that. So if people are interested in hearing more about that, I'll post a link along with this so that everybody can find that. It's also on the depthinsights.com radio page site. So meanwhile, also Robbie has recently been teaching an online lecture series on James Hillman's Alchemical Studies, and that's been via Jung Platform, and that's been happening over the past couple of years. And he's going to continue in September with the third part in the series. It's a 10-meeting course, and it happens over a period of 6 months. So you can find out more about that at jungplatform.com. Robbie, is there more you'd like to say about that course before we dive into our
Yes, it's actually the fourth semester. I did 2 semesters together with Pat Berry, and then this year, I did silver by myself. We're following the different metals, the different colors, the different procedures that exist in alchemy from the perspective of alchemical psychology, because that's what James Hillman developed. He moved from Jung's notion of the psychology of alchemy to alchemical psychology, which was an important move for the whole field. And so I'm trying to follow his book, Alchemical Psychology, that is James Hillman Uniform Edition number 5. And I am following that from beginning to end because I believe that his alchemical psychology is a major step forward in our field.
Yes, well, it is a very dense work, to be sure, and those of us who have attempted to read it probably can attest to that. And from the courses that I've attended with you over that Jung Platform course over these last couple of years, I really have appreciated so much the ability to kind of go through that line by line and have you sort of act almost as an interpreter or translator for those of us who are following along to begin to understand it.
Yeah, and that I'm going through it line by line means that people can just drop in. It doesn't mean that you have to have followed the previous ones, because we are now starting the color yellow and the notion of, or the image of the stone, philosopher's stone, or red sulphur, as it is called in my series of novels, and as the alchemists called it. And so you can actually start right now and start to follow it. So you don't have to have previous knowledge before you go into this course.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And so again, that course is called Yellowing and the Stone, Fermentation and the Goal of the Opus. And that's hosted by Jung Platform, and you can find it at jungplatform.com. Jung Platform, of course, was started by a friend of ours, Michiel Kirk, and he's done an amazing job of bringing some really good quality courses and lectures there.
Yes, I want to compliment both of you, both Michiel for the Jung Platform and you for Depth Psychology Alliance. They're very important resources in our field.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, certainly all of us who are working to make depth psychology more accessible in the world, I think have kind of a calling to do that. So
Yes.
including you obviously too. So great. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. I wonder, Robbie, if you can just start and share some of your background just briefly. I'm sure we'll have a wide range of people who are listening to this or watching it. And I think that a lot of them will be already familiar with alchemy and how it relates to Jungian psychology. But I wonder if you can start by sharing a little bit about how you got into the field or how your interest was generated.
Right. Well, as you may know, alchemy was very central to Jung's thinking. And so if you would go to the Jung Institute in Zurich, as I did, it was unavoidable. You had to learn it. And actually, they said to me that in order to graduate from the Jung Institute, you have to be able to read the Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is Jung's major book about alchemy, by yourself without help. And so I started studying alchemy, alchemical psychology, or as Jung would call it, the psychology of alchemy, in 1971. That's a long time ago. It's 45 years ago. And I came to the Jung Institute actually not directly to study alchemy or to even study psychology. What happened to me was that I had suffered from a serious illness, and that I ended up in the hospital for 11 months. And after that, my illness wasn't cured, and so it was okay for a while, but then it came right back. And so I decided that this would be the way to go, and so I ended up in Zurich at the Jung Institute. I actually went to the Jung Institute to get a staying permit in order to work with Aniela Jaffe, who you may know from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and she became my analyst. And then also James Hillman became my analyst, and after a while I got more and more interested in alchemy because also he was working a lot on alchemy, as did Aniela, but he was very, very interested in it. And I began to read his papers, and mainly all these papers in here, most of them I've heard him speak as lectures. And so it's very interesting for me to read them again now that I'm 40 years later, and just remember how I was struggling with it in the lectures. And so I decided a while back that most people who haven't really studied this extensively will not have any idea what he's talking about, because what he's doing in this book is very similar to what Jung does in the Mysterium. Is he no longer waits for people to catch up. He just runs on. Jung was doing that with the Mysterium because he'd had a heart attack. He didn't know how long he was going to live. So he was just writing, and if you could follow it, you could follow it. And if you didn't, bad luck. That left a lot of people in the dust. And Hillman was even more so. And so that's why I thought he needed an interpreter. And also that we are much further along in the age of body. And so it had, in my field, this embodied imagination. So we had to work it more from the sense of an embodied imagination of alchemy. So that's where I come in.
It's fascinating and amazing to think that you've had that long of a career, and also the opportunity that it's been for you to kind of steep in alchemy for 40 years. For those people who are new to it, it may be much more difficult, but I can certainly see how Jung and Hillman both would reach a point in their own careers where they would just run on like that and be
right. Yes, and these are run-on books.
The knowledge, right?
And so I think it is up to us to the next generation to slow it down and let it go the way you do with dreams. Actually, dreams are worked by slowing them down, because as you slow down a dream, you can get into the images, you can get into a flashback of the images, and the images come alive as worlds and as environments and as living beings. And we do the same actually with these texts, so that the texts come alive. And not only the texts of the alchemists, but the alchemical writings of, in this case, James Hillman.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, on that note, can you talk a little bit about the difference between how Jung saw alchemy and alchemy's role in depth psychology, which I think is kind of more of a traditional view for most Jungians and depth psychologists, and then maybe contrast that and talk a little bit about how James Hillman approached it differently?
Yeah, I think that it's a good idea to keep this notion that Jung was doing the psychology of alchemy. This is the title of one of his books, and Hillman does alchemical psychology. So what Jung did was he was applying his method, he was applying his narrative to alchemy. And his narrative was about the integration of self, it was about anima and animus and shadow. And so he would take these notions that he had and then put it all in the language of alchemy, or in the language of alchemy, he would find his narrative. And Hillman broke with that. He said, it is not so much that we are doing a psychology of alchemy, but we have to see what the alchemical language can offer psychology. So let's take alchemy primary, not psychology. We take alchemy primary. So we get an alchemical psychology. And in that way, he goes into the details more than Jung does. Jung is about the whole story, the overarching story. And that's why he calls his book, The Mysterium Conjunctionis, the most important book, because it all moves towards the mystical marriage in his notion of the work. And also there are many alchemical writings that end up in the mystical marriage. But Hillman was interested in the procedures. He was interested in how these substances would go through their changes, and this notion that, and he took that, of course, from Henri Corbin, the notion that these images were substances, they were living substances, but that's because that's what they were for the alchemists, right? For the alchemist, images are alive, for the alchemist, metals are alive. All the materials that they work with are living materials. So it's an interaction between the alchemist and living materials. So it's a love story. It's the way, and it's frequently seen as copulation. It's frequently seen as forms of lovemaking in different settings. And sometimes these images have a sense of being pornographic because they are really going into the love between the metals, the love between the materials, and the love between the alchemist and the materials. And it is this old notion that we still have in the Bible, where knowing has a sexual connotation. He knew this woman was that they had intercourse, sexual intercourse. And so knowing is about intercourse. And we talked about that in our last interview, that it is really in alchemy not so much that you know intellectually, that you know with your mind, but you know with your heart and with your body. And so knowing and loving is the same thing. Mm. And that is very important for Hillman for this book. And then you can see how this love goes, or this relationship goes through a whole color scheme. And that's what we're working on, all the different colors of love.
Mm. That's beautiful. You really make that come alive for me when you describe it in that way. And I'm sure it was very much alive for them.
Well, it was very alive for the alchemists. And you have to see that that we are in this post Cartesian era, where Descartes would tell us, and that was not just Descartes, but it was the whole, Descartes is usually our whipping boy, but long before him, that subjectivity is only human subjectivity. The only subjectivity that exists is human subjectivity. In alchemy, there are many subjectivities. The metals have their own subjectivity. And so that is really important, because all the metals and all the materials that they worked with are alive. That interests me very much also from the perspective of current technology. We are working on a conference called Deep Imagination and Technology at Pacifica. And it is all about how these ideas that create apps, that create hardware, that create software, are living, they are alive. So if we can plug into their life in the same way that the alchemist plugged into the materials, then we can let the inventions come to life and help them to come to life by themselves with our help. And it's a very different attitude.
Yeah, that's really brilliant, because I think that a lot of us who have been students of depth psychology in some form for a long time are really attuned to the idea of the anima mundi, or the idea that the world is ensouled and that everything around us is ensouled, and that we can have those same kind of dynamic interactions with things that we wouldn't typically think of, such as plants, trees, animals, rocks, even those kinds of things. But when you begin to bring that into the metals and therefore extending it to technology, I think it becomes a very different thing.
Yeah, that's what the big change that Hillman brought in his book Revisioning Psychology, which is his central book based on the Terry lectures that he held at Yale, where he says the first chapter is about personifying, that psyche always presents itself as personified, and imagination constantly personifies. And that is not that we project that onto the material. That is already a 19th century notion, that my subjectivity projects itself on that dead matter, and that's the kind of animism of the 19th century. No, it is that these presences, the moment that they become part of imagination, actually take on life, and that we can communicate with that life because imagination works that way.
And of course, that explains why when you talk about this as almost a sexual sort of interactive, sensual experience of engaging with the other, is
yes,
other thing, whatever that is. I suppose what happens is then the union becomes evident. The fact that those things would come together and to know one another, as you put it, really becomes the ultimate goal of these things, which of course is
communion between. It was very interesting. I once worked with an inventor, and we got to that point of seeing it from the side that his inventions are actually alive and that he communicates with them. He said, "Oh, that's so good," because we had worked on a particular problem that he was working in. He says, "Now I can make love to it." And so it's different from trying to understand it, trying to grasp it.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and then that begins to take you down a path where you can start to use certain tools. You can actually learn how to engage with these things, but it also speaks to the fact that we each have an innate tendency to be able to engage, to have these kinds of relationships. That's our humanity, right? That's our consciousness, being able to engage in that way.
Right. And it is the fundamental structure of imagination, that the moment that you enter into imagination, it begins to personify. It cannot do anything else.
Right.
That's why we have dreams.
Right, absolutely. And of course, I remember Jung telling the story about how he was in the kitchen and he began, I don't know if it was him that told the story or someone else about him, but he was in the kitchen and began to speak to the pots and pans that were misbehaving as they were sort of falling around the kitchen. Do you remember that story?
No, I don't, but I can imagine that somebody like that would say that.
Yeah. And you can take my word for it. I think it's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, actually. But so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the different stages in alchemy, particularly the colors, because some of us know about the stages like coagulatio and solucio and some of the different stages that speak to the consistency or the texture or the process that's happening. But what about the colors? That's not maybe as familiar to everybody, especially if they haven't read Hillman.
Right. Well, the colors are very important to Jung. The way that it's usually taken is that there are 4 colors: black and white and yellow and red. And this article that we're going to be working on is how the yellow dropped out. And I will tell you a little bit about the yellow in a moment. There are more colors. And again, as you see, this is this is a narrative structure that already has been given to it, that it's a movement from black to white to yellow to red, as if it were one ongoing story, which is usually the story of the hero, the movement from the single story. But what Hillman has been doing is that each of these colors have their own story. And so there are their own stories. These are all different storybooks. So the storybooks that alchemy is talking about is the green, which is part of green behind the ears, greenhorn. It is the beginning of the process of when everything is new and fresh and natural. It's the beginning of the process is seen as natural. It's the prima materia. The first thing that happens to this, and now I'm going into the narrative fantasy, okay? And you have to see that this narration that I'm now doing is a way of describing it. It is just a way of describing it. It's not the central thing. It's the same thing as saying that the search engine is the reality. The search engine is just the search engine. So I give you the search engine. And then the green starts to turn black because it has to go through a phase of rot, and everything that starts out, if it stays the way it starts out, then nothing changes. So the change takes place in the blackening. The change takes place in the rotting. It's called the nigredo, the darkening, the blackening. And it's a moment of warfare, of things falling apart. Our elections are very much in the nigredo, where forces are fighting each other to the death, which is very much what's happening right now. And it's an ongoing fight in which something old is falling apart because, as Yeats would say, the center no longer holds. And so that is the black the black phase, which is compulsive, which is depressed, and the feeling of depression, of course, is I can't. It's a feeling of despair. It is all falling apart and nothing can be saved from it. That is the black. And then, and again, this is the search engine. Then it would turn to dark blue, and dark blue is what we call the blues, or country songs, and the sense of sadness and regret. And she took my car, she took my dog, she took my house, country songs. And the strong feeling of loss that is in the dark blue, and then it would say that it would move to the light blue, which is called the Salem. The Salem is the heaven, and the light blue is the creative spark in everything. So then the creative spark begins to come out, because the way that alchemists see the world is that it's a coagulation of the creative spark. So it's different from physics. The main difference between alchemy and physics actually is not about the atomic structure, because many alchemists believed in the atomic system, but that in our physics system, when you get to the core of matter, you get to energy. And that is the nuclear bomb, that is the whole notion of nuclear energy. In alchemy, when you get to the core of matter, because they say matter encrusts around this core, at the core of matter lies creativity, lies the creative spark that exists in everything. So that the alchemists are trying to free this creative spark, and that is called the Salem, that is the blue, and then it would move the light blue, and then it would move to the white, and the white is what we talked about in the previous semester. The white is the moment of reflection, and in the reflection, the mirror, the silver, in this white silver reflection, we begin to differentiate between our actions and what drives us in our actions. And this point of reflection is a very essential part of all of analysis. because that's how you begin to hold it, keep it in mind. So that's why it's also called unio mentalis. It's a way of keeping things in mind. You could call it mindfulness. So silver is mindful. And then it would go to yellow, and that's what we're going to be talking about. In yellow, what happens is that this keeping things in mindfulness begins to ferment. So the notion is not, and that's why the importance of the yellow, the notion is not that you can get from mindfulness directly into action. If you move from mindfulness directly into action, you can very easily get into a conversion experience, into a moment where something that you had in mind is trying to put directly into the world. No, the goal of the reflection is that the reflection moves into the body, and as it moves into the body, it begins to ferment the whole body. And that fermentation process of the inside, that is the yellow. And therefore, the whole body ferments through the inside, through the mindfulness, the whole body ferments, and out of that yellow, that fermentation, the action can come, which is the red, which is the rubedo, which is the movement towards the stone, which is to the core of all creativity, and where the action becomes an act of creativity. So that's basically the notion of the colors in alchemy.
That's a beautiful, I mean, you've got the whole rainbow of the spectrum there, of course. And I had some curiosities as you kind of went along and described that, and we won't spend too much time on it, but I was curious about the role of the mind and the body in this, because you had mentioned in the silver phase, keeping things in mind, or the reflection phase that allows us to kind of hold that, I guess, until some kind of transformation can occur. And so, of course, I'm wondering about that container, because all alchemists work with the best.
Yes, it is holding it in the vessel. It is an introverted period. White is usually related very much to an introverted sense, and red is more an extroverted sense. And in that introverted sense, you are able to hold on to all the different tensions and not acting them out. You hold them in, and that is something that depth psychology has frequently had a bias towards. That holding things and keeping things in mind and reflecting is seen as very positive, and therefore people frequently don't go into any kind of action because they feel that reflection is more important than action, which I think is extremely dangerous, because I think in the end, something has to become an act. If you don't, and an act, I mean a symbolic act, an act that goes into the world, because if you don't let your actions move into the world and you stay in the stage of reflection, nothing will change. You will become beautifully wise, but you become completely useless. And you have to bring it into the world. It has to turn inside out, right? That's called the inversion. So it has to turn from its initial state of reflection into something that is actable. We cannot just reflect on what is happening in our politics. We have to become actively involved. And if you become actively involved directly from the reflection and just become actively involved in the mind and start writing about it, you don't have as much thrust as when it has moved entirely through your body and your body comes into action.
So here's the question that occurs to me from hearing that, because I agree with you completely about the whole idea of the bias toward the holding of that. A lot of people maybe feel that alchemy is kind of an esoteric subject and are not as sure about our capacity to actually sort of become alchemists ourselves, I guess, within our own process. So when I hear you describe that holding and you're saying it needs to transform, and then the yellowing is the fermentation process, is there something actually that we can do to make that happen? Or is that simply a matter of time, grace, right combination of elements in one's life? How does that work?
Well, in the first place, it's important to realize that once you have an insight, that is not the end. An insight is just a step along the way. And as you have these insights, you begin to sense how that affects your life, how that affects your body, how does it affect your being. And as you have those insights and let them affect you, and wait until you feel that your whole being is beginning to change because of these insights, that it's not the insights that go into the world, but your being that has been affected by these insights. And then you will notice that your actions will have a bigger and stronger thrust because it turns into a more powerful. And so the task is that these insights first transform you. You be transformed by these insights. You don't just throw these insights into the world. You let yourself be transformed by these insights. And that's basically what we're trying to do in this course about the yellow, the first part of the course, which is about the yellow, to see how that happens, how that works. How does it work that these insights transform into embodied states that then later can move into the world?
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And of course, your use of the word embodied is what is really bringing it all together for me. You talked about the need to take action or to be activists. And of course, for each of us, that might mean something completely different. Some people that are very introverted aren't going to be out in the street marching with signs. And yet there are so many things that can be done to integrate.
Right.
And it also brings in the power of somatic movement of some kind, or some kind of a practice that does engage the body, of being out in nature, of doing things like yoga or some kind of movement practice.
Yes, yes. And as our friend Bessel van der Kolk always tells us, you have to have something that is related to the body to work on trauma. You cannot just do it through insight. And that is a very, very clear about how this works. If you don't bring the insights into your body, then they are going to be ineffective.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think the power of alchemy is really irrefutable. We have all seen it at work in our lives one way or another, and whether or not we've been able to name that and put that sort of metaphoric image to it maybe is a completely different thing, but it just strikes me how powerful this is. And once you begin to have the kind of language, imagery, and understanding of alchemy to see exactly what it is that we're doing here, it begins to make a lot more sense. And I think that each one of us can, start to garner some of those insights you were talking about and actually initiate that transformation just by studying it.
Yes, and by going into details and by going into the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah.
Because as Hillman says, it is the nitty-gritty, the grit, that forms the pearl.
So true. Yeah, I was one of those kids that had that rock polisher machine, where you put the rocks in and then you run it for a while. Yeah. So that's how you make the stone, I guess.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, Robbie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been just absolutely a pleasure to speak with you. I just want to remind everybody that Robbie will be teaching the Jung Platform lecture series starting September 15th, and that is on the yellowing and the stone, fermentation, and the goal of Opus. And you can find out more information at jungplatform.com. And you can also find out more about Robbie and his work. Robbie, you have an organization called Cyber Dreamwork, and the website, you can tell us the website for that?
Yes, it's called cyberdreamwork.com. It's the oldest interactive website on depth psychology. It's started in 1997 and has been active now for 19 years on the internet. And at the moment, the site is under construction, but I think that the construction will end soon. And then the other website would be santabarbarahealingsanctuary.com.
Very good. And of course, Robbie has a presence on Facebook, so you can follow him there as well. Thank you again so much, Robbie.
Yes. You're most welcome, and thank you very much for having me.